Hi, I'm Gina, and in this video I'm going to show you how to make a Dorset flower button. I'm also going to show you a few extra embellishment ideas at the end. So let's get started. The first thing that you'll need to do is cover a ring. I prefer rounded rings for most Dorset buttons, but it's entirely up to you if you'd prefer to use a flat one. You cover the ring with thread. This is called casting. And then you slick, which is pushing the ridge of the covering stitch, which is a blanket stitch, to the back of the button ring. Now if you'd like, if you've never made a Dorset button before, I'll put a link below to my basic Dorset button video which shows you this process. The next thing that you need to do is to lay the spokes. Okay, so position the thread on the wrapped ring at the top and then come straight down at the center of the ring and come up, and that's one wrap. And for this particular design, this is from my book Dorset Ring Buttons, we're going to lay 8 wraps for 16 spokes. So that's one, move slightly over and still going at the center of the ring, so 2, and so that is 8 wraps, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, which will give 16 spokes. The spokes are from the center out. Now I can see that they're a little bit uneven, but I'm not going to worry about that. I'll show you what we can do for that. So the first thing I'm going to do is center the spokes, because as you can see they've gone a little bit off center. So centering the spokes is basically adding a few stitches at the center to pull in those wraps. Now what you're doing is you're putting the 2 layers of the wraps together as well as keeping them as central as you possibly can in the ring. Okay, so that can mean, as you can see, taking your needle and just pushing things around a little bit. You can put as many stitches here as you wish. I usually do about 3 or 4. But you can sort of make a feature of it by having one through every single spoke as well. Now what I like to do, you don't have to, but what I like to do is I like to secure this, so I will go underneath the wrap at the back just once, and then I can just square up a little bit, and I don't have to worry about those crossed stitches actually slipping at all. Now if there's any that you see that your spacing bothers you a little bit, at this point you can just take your needle and just move it over a little bit. That's usually what I do if I'm a little bit sort of unsure about it. Now in the book I'm using a smaller ring, and for that matter a finer thread. So in the book for every one of them I recommend a ring and recommend a thread size so that I can give you exact instructions. But of course you are going to use different size rings, different size threads, and so you're going to need to adapt those instructions. So I will start out with the filling stitch of a rounding back stitch, and I will start out with 5 rows just as the book says, and then we'll make a judgment call. So a rounding back stitch is the basic filling stitch of the Dorset button. So you come up between 2 spokes and then you come back around one of them and then come back up around the next one. And so it is just basically a back stitch around a spoke, and then you move along to the next spoke. And it's a rounding back stitch because you are working in the round. Now what this does sort of on a traditional button is that it pulls the top and bottom layers of the thread together to help to make a more secure button, a more secure fabric, really. Now, bearing in mind that sort of the original Dorset buttons were very, very small, only a few rows of this then shored everything up and made for a secure button. But of course, when you're working sort of modern decorative designs, these stitches come in really handy because they add texture. And I think that's one of the reasons why Dorset buttons often look so good in a single colour. So as you can see, that what this is doing is it's adding a little rib to the actual spoke. So I'll do a few rows, well, I'll do a few more. I'll probably do like another row. I'm just going through there, just so that you can see how that is actually developing, and then obviously I'll edit out because the last thing that you want to see is a lot of this. Now if you start to get your thread kinking up a little bit, all you need to do is, let me just do this row and then I can show you, because it should be just about the point. Okay, don't like to leave things in the middle of a row. So if you're starting to see that you have a bit of kink in your thread, take your needle end and hold up. And then when you spin, you just let the weight of the button fall. It will spin out, and that will spin out your excess twist and will help to stop any kinking with your thread, which the kinks are what cause the, you know, when you get those knots in your thread. So that's just a little easy way to deal with them. And so you just work from the center out. And again, you can see the ridges are starting to form quite nicely on there. So I'll carry on and work the 5 rows, because I'm sure you don't need to sort of watch all of those. So I've worked 5 rows of the rounding back stitch over one spoke. So you can see you've got some nice little ridges there. So now what I'm going to do is the same stitch, the rounding back stitch, but this time over 2 spokes. So my thread is here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to these 2, so to this next pair basically, and I'm going to come back, instead of over 1 spoke, I'm going to come back over 2 spokes, and I'm going to pull in slightly. Okay, so I'm going to pull that closed, and then I'm going to come along to the next 2, come back over those 2 and pull in. And I'm going to repeat this all of the way around. And you see my finger at the back, which is helping to hold this thread tight whilst I'm working it, because that won't hold on its own. It needs to that tension to hold those spokes in to make the petals. And I'm going to do this. I would always recommend at least 2 rows because you want to make sure that you get that tension held in place. But obviously how many rows will depend upon how much space you have and how much you can pull in these spokes without sort of making the whole thing too uneven. So really what you're doing is just emphasizing that flower design by dislodging the placement of the spokes. I think that 2 rows will work quite nicely on this. Now, one thing that I am going to do is I'm going to take this thread at the back because I want it to be even all of the way around, and something that you can sort of, sometimes you can notice it and sometimes you don't. But I'll take it to this particular spoke so that it's even and just pop my thread underneath there. And that will just give us a more, the background looks a little bit more even as it works around. And then I'm going to finish this off by coming to the center. Just take my thread around the needle a couple of times and pull through. Now, if you're not somebody who watches my videos, I always then finish off. I do not recommend using that bit of thread to sew your button in place, because if you do that, your button has a chance of, if it gets cut off of a garment to be kept because it's such a pretty button, suddenly the integrity of the button's lost. So sew your button on with something different. So there we have the basic flower button. Okay, so as you can see, there's a lot that you can do. You can put more spokes on, lots more flowers. You can then make variations where you then cover right up to here. You can add chain stitch, all sorts of different things in order to make the button. What I'm going to show you now is 2 different things, really. So the first thing I'm going to show you is adding a little bit of extra color as a variation. So I'm just getting a little bit of, going to use green, and I'm going to place a little knot at the end. I'm single threading it onto the needle. And I'm just going to attach that to the back of the button. And then I'm going to come up at the outer edge of the background, and then I'm going to take the thread in and just pull a little bit. And I'm going to do that all of the way around. And this is serving 2 purposes. One, obviously it's adding a little bit of color, but by pulling in, it also adds a slightly different shape there. But I think it also emphasizes the petals when you do something like this. And I'm not pulling that too hard. You can also work a chain stitch here if you want a lazy daisy stitch. That works quite nice as well. You could work long bullion stitches as well to really add texture. It's a very simple way of adding a little bit of colour to the centre of that Dorset button. And now I said about doing a chain, so why not carry on the theme a bit more, and we can add what is a chain stitch, which isn't really a chain stitch. So I'm going to come up and I'm going to do what's called a reverse back stitch. So I'm going to come back over two, so that there's a long stitch on the front, and then I'm going to come up and around the one. Then back over two, which obviously these are closer together, so it will only be short, but it's the same principle, and then under one. And so basically this is the same stitch, but you're working the solid on the face of the button and the rib or the ridge on the back of the button. Now for this first one, you can see that my needle is coming up above the thread, okay, and that's quite important. The thing about working any of these buttons is that you can just keep going and doodle and make it up as you go along, and I think that once you sort of get the hang of it, you will, that's part of what the addiction is, really. Now this next row, I'm going to come over exactly the same, but instead of bringing my needle, let's just take that little twist out. Instead of bringing my needle above the thread, I'm going to bring my needle under this thread, okay? And when I work a couple of stitches this way, you'll see why. Creates an effect as if you have worked a chain stitch. Can you see that? It's really an effective, it's just the placement of the needle, and I find things like this quite fascinating. It's like pattern building in weaving. Perhaps it's because it's the play on light, I don't know, it's just the textures and everything. This is part of what I find so fascinating about working with textiles. I know my thumb's in the way and you can't really see what's happening, but I hope that that means that you'll be pleasantly surprised when I reveal. How that actually turns out. But it's because I'm trying to hold this thread up so that I get the needle in the right place. So let's see if I can move my hands out of the way and go a little bit more slowly for this part. Sometimes I forget I'm filming myself and just whip along, which doesn't help you. Right, and then I'm just going to close that one down, do a little bit of it. Actually, I put that in the wrong place. That way. There we go. And then I'm going to fasten this at the back, first behind the stitch so it doesn't drop down too soon, and then as before, down to the center, wrap around to create a little knot. Thank Thanks ever so much for watching. If you are interested in making Dorset buttons, I'll pop the information below about what materials I've actually used on this particular button. And I'll also link, as I said before, to my basic Dorset button tutorial. But also on my button making playlist you'll find lots of other buttons, including my Dorset Rainbow and other Dorset buttons. There's a Yarrow as well. And if you're interested in Dorset button making and you're starting to become addicted, my book Dorset Ring Buttons is available from my website. Thanks ever so much for watching. Do click subscribe and hit the like button. Leave me a comment. Let me know what else you'd like to see and I can see if I can do it. Take care of yourselves. Bye bye.